If you and I told our boss that port security can be used to help mitigate or reduce the risk of a CAM table overflow attack, it's not just talking about the technique of port security, it's actually implementing it. So, in this nugget, you and I are going to take a look at the commands that we can use to both implement and verify port security to mitigate and reduce the risk of a CAM table overflow attack. So, without further ado, let's go directly to the command line of a Cisco Catalyst switch. So let's have some fun with this. I've got Switch 1 and a Kali Linux box, and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and launch an attack. I'm going to use MacOff. The -I simply says go ahead and launch the attack over Ethernet 0, and I am connected via SSH to this Kali box. So the control channel between us and that little Raspberry Pi running Kali is over wireless. That's how we're connecting to it, and then it's plugged into a switch port on Switch 1. And now let's go to the switch and let's ask the switch how it's doing. We'll do a show MAC address table count for VLAN 123. The Kali box happens to be plugged into an access port on VLAN 123. And the switch is saying, my life isn't so good right now. It's getting very dismal, in fact. And I've got 5,925 that have all been learned on VLAN 123. And the Kali Linux box is relentless. That little Raspberry Pi is just pumping those out there as fast as it can. So let's go ahead and stop the attack. We'll go back up to our Kali box. I'll do a Control-C to stop the madness. Now back on the switch, let's go ahead and configure port security. Now I am remotely connected to the switch. I'm not on the console port. So what I'm going to do is turn on terminal monitor so we can see log messages as they're being sent to the VTY session that I'm on. Next, we've gone into interface gig 0/2. That happens to be the port that the Kali box is currently connected to. So it's Ethernet 0 on the Kali box and gig 0/2 on the switch. And although it's already been done, I'm going to do this to demonstrate its importance. I'm going to specify that this port is an access port specifically. Again, we cannot have switch port security. It won't work if we have a dynamic port. It needs to be an access port or a trunk. Next, I'm just going to make sure that this port, this access port, belongs to VLAN 123. Again, that may have been done previously, but I want to make sure it's correct. Next, let's set the maximum number of MAC addresses that are allowed to be learned on this port. Let's set it to 5. I think 1 is really strict. For example, you could have virtual machines with different MAC addresses running on your computer. So I think anything less than 10 is probably not malicious. So here we'll set it to 5. And that means that the 6th MAC address learned on this port will go ahead and trigger a port security violation. And while we're here, and because we can, let's set up the aging parameters as well. Let's tell the switch that for this port, we want to go ahead and age out after 5 minutes, and we want to do it based on inactivity, not an absolute timer from the first time we learned the MAC address to aging it out, but rather 5 minutes of inactivity. Now next, we have a violation mode to deal with. Now the default violation mode, do you remember what it is? What does the switch do by default if there's a switch port security violation? And if you're saying, Keith, I know it does a shutdown of that port, you would be absolutely right. So in this case, let's go ahead and set up the restrict option instead of the default shutdown option for the port. And to do that, it's switch port security violation restrict. And if we wanted to add a single static MAC address, we could do that as well as one of our 5. So we can do that with the command switch port security MAC address, and then the 12-character MAC address that we want to go ahead and have the switch know about on that port. Next, this is the part that I often forget. After all of these switch port security commands that we've done, those are all just parameters. We have to still enable the feature. And the way we enable the feature is with the command switch port-security enter. And that actually turns on the feature, and they'll start using all the parameters that we specified. So let's take a look at the configuration on this port, which is gig 0/2. So it's an access port. Again, it cannot be a dynamic port. It has to be either a trunk or an access port. It's been assigned to VLAN 123. The maximum number of MAC addresses is 5. So the 6th MAC address learned on this port will trigger a violation. That violation will be restrict. The aging time is 5 minutes, and that's based on 5 minutes of inactivity. And there is our static MAC address that we configured on this port. If we want to see the address that we've configured without having to do a show run or a show run interface, we could just issue the command show port security address, and it will tell us. Right there's the address that we configured. It's on VLAN 123 because that port is an access port for VLAN 123. and it shows us the port. That way it kind of gives us a bird's eye view of any hard-coded secure MAC addresses that we have with port security. Another option is we could do a show port security for the entire box or for a specific interface to see the details regarding port security. So here's our current port security status of enabled. Now if this showed disabled, it's very likely because we forgot to issue the command all by itself, switch port-security in that interface. It's currently up. We have not had a violation, and even if we did have a violation, the violation action is to restrict, not to shut down. And there's our violation mode right there. We have the 5-minute inactivity for aging out MAC addresses that were dynamically learned. There's also an option for static addresses that we've configured to be aged out, and we didn't enable the aging out of static addresses, so that's why it says disabled here. Here we have the maximum number of MAC addresses, which is 5. If we do want to enable sticky learning, we do so with this command, switch port security, MAC address sticky, and that turns on sticky learning. So let's get out of configuration mode. I'm going to turn off terminal monitor as well with terminal no monitor. And now let's go ahead and launch the attack. In fact, I want terminal monitor on so we can see the benefit of those syslog messages that the restrict violation option is going to give us. So we'll turn terminal monitor back on so we can see those messages. And now let's go launch the attack. We'll go back to our Kali box. I'll hit the up arrow key. And we'll launch MAC off again using Ethernet 0. So now that that's flooding, if we take a look back at the switch, we have these port security violation messages coming up saying it's happening, and here's the last MAC address I saw that triggered it. And fortunately, there's a little interval in between, because if we had some customer sending tens of thousands of bogus source MAC addresses, which Kali Linux is doing right now, by the way, we wouldn't want to have our screen just overtaken with those messages. So let's go ahead back to Kali Linux. I'm going to do a Control-C to stop that madness. Let's go back to the switch, and let's do a show port security. Take a look at the details of what's happened. So this is a great picture of what's going on. So it looks like port 6 has port security configured, and port 6 looks like it's using the defaults with a maximum of 1 MAC address. Currently it doesn't know about any MAC addresses. It's had no security violations, and the violation action is shut down. That's for port 6. Now our Kali Linux box, which is on port 2, the maximum number of addresses that are supported are 5. It currently has 5. One of them static, the other 4 are dynamic. And it's had 28,913 security violations in the short time that we were running MAC off against it. And the action is restrict, and that's why the port didn't get shut down. Now on port 6, let's say that port 6 was indeed a trunk, and we wanted to go ahead and do port security on that. Well, to do that, I'm going to first go to that interface and say that you're going to be a trunk. I'm going to specify the trunk encapsulation and the trunking mode of on. And then I'm going to set port security with a maximum of 50, but just for a specific VLAN of 123. And again, most of the options as they relate to port security, when we're working with trunks, we can tag on the VLAN identifier that we want to work with or apply to so that we can implement the type of port security that we want and with the numbers that we want that are specific to a given VLAN. So here's our trunking encapsulation, here's our trunking mode, and this says the maximum of 50 MAC addresses regarding VLAN 123. And the switch port security actually turns on the feature. And it is time, my friend, for our assessment check. So take a moment. If you need more time, just pause the music and answer these questions, and then we'll review them together. Good luck. Well, my friend, how did you do? Let's take a look. Question number 1. Why does port security prevent CAM table overflow attacks? And if you said, Keith, that's easy. CAM table overflow attacks are limited because we're limiting at a port-by-port basis the number of MAC addresses that can be learned by the switch on that port. You'd be absolutely correct. That's one of the features of port security. Question number 2. Which option places MAC addresses into the running config of the switch? And when I think of the answer to this, I think of a Cinnabon at the airport. Sticky, sticky, sticky. It is sticky learning that puts a MAC address that's been learned into the running config. And then question number 3, what type of switch port can't use port security? And if it's a Cisco switch with a license that supports port security, there's a possibility of not being able to use it if that port is a dynamic port. It cannot be a dynamic port. You have to set it as either a trunk port or an access port, but it cannot be a dynamic port. And that would be a situation when we can't use port security on a switch that otherwise supports it. So, my friend, how did you do? If you got 3 out of 3, I want you to put your right hand in the air and say, "Oh yeah." And if your coworkers are looking at you, you can just say, "Oh yeah," one more time, and then let them know what you're doing. Because, my friend, it is absolutely okay to celebrate our success as we watch, learn, and conquer together. Because we realize that just hoping that a CAM table overflow attack won't happen against us isn't enough, in this nugget we've walked through the steps systematically for implementing and verifying port security on a Cisco Catalyst switch. Hey, thanks for joining me in this nugget. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.